now for something completely different. Or back to the beginning of the thing, really. So at the very start of the evening, those of you who were here at the very beginning will have heard Matthew give this really wonderful introduction about Terry Pratchett and Trinity, and the reason that we do, the Pratchett Project, and the reason that we have this Culture Night event now as an annual thing that's been going since 2017. That Pratchett had these amazing links with Trinity as an institution. So we gave him an honorary degree. He liked that a lot. He was an adjunct professor in the School of English, where I work, and taught on our MPhil in popular literature at the time and our MPhil in creative writing, and had, very much immersed himself in the project of engaging with academic research around fiction. And, a lot of writers can be a bit cagey about what it is academics actually do with fiction, that we write the thing, or they write the thing and put it out into the world, and then we say mean things about it, or we start pulling it apart, and can you not just enjoy the book? And the answer is no. And the answer is actually you enjoy it more when you start pulling it open and seeing how things happen. It's kind of like, you might really, really enjoy eating cake, but if you know how cakes are made, you can really appreciate them in different ways and exciting ways. It doesn't detract from how much you enjoyed the cake before you know how to bake. So we have a sort of witching hour lined up. We've got 3 talks from staff and researchers associated with the School of English in Trinity about witches, about Terry Pratchett's witches books. These are something that we're interested in and passionate about. What we're going to do, because we're realizing that we're close to the end of the evening and you might be tired and all the rest of it, that we're going to do the 3 talks. And then if we've got time, we're going to do questions at the very end rather than holding up the show. So first up, we've got Dr. Dara Downey, who's a teaching fellow in American Lit, or American literature. I should read my notes fully. Her research and teaching interests are so wide-ranging, but they center on Gothic literature, American literature, and fantasy. She's teaching on the MPhil in modern and contemporary literature and on children's literature. And today she's going to talk about folk magic in Terry Pratchett's Tiffany Aching books. Hand over to Dara. My nose runs when I start talking, so that's why I got the tissue in a dress with no pockets. Very irritatingly. So, yes, as Jane says, I work mainly on the Gothic. I'm also a long-term Terry Pratchett fan, and general fan of fantasy literature and children's fantasy literature in particular. And as Jane says, sometimes when you know what's going on behind something, it does actually make it better. And I came to the Tiffany Aching books relatively late, only about kind of 2 or 3 years ago, and I happened to be reading them around the same time as I was reading. Hold on, none of these buttons make any sense. How do I go down? How do I do this? Sorry. That way. No, where's the mouse? Okay. There. Right-handed people. Anyway, so I was reading this around the same time that I was reading a book by a person called Silvia Federici. I'm really not managing this at all. Why is it not? Sorry. Okay, let's forget about my slides because I don't know how to make that work at all. How do I make it clicky downy?
Just press it.
But not, okay, right. That won't bring me to this next slide. I was terrified. Okay. So this lady here, Silvia Federici, who's really great, is someone who writes a lot about kind of how we ended up with the vision of witchcraft that we have now today. And as far as she's concerned, it is entirely tied up with kind of the rise of capitalism in the Western world, and that goes along with colonization. She kind of sees the two things as entirely connected with one another, and also essentially with kind of a new codification of misogyny, right? So she says that this is kind of how we get witchcraft. So this is one of the things that she says in her book, Caliban and the Witch. She says that because the capitalist organization of work aimed at controlling nature, she says it must refuse the unpredictability implicit in the practice of magic. And so as a result, she says the world has to be disenchanted in order to be dominated. And this involved 2 things in particular. First and foremost, she says it's about controlling space. So she describes the witch hunts in particular on both sides of the Atlantic as being a strategy of enclosure, she says, which depending on the context could be enclosure of land, of bodies, or of social relations. But land, I think, is kind of the thing that really, when I was reading the Tiffany Aching books, I was like, oh, there's something going on here. I think I kind of know what she's talking about. And of course, Federici also mentions women. She talks about the fact that all of this was also happening because the witch was the embodiment of the world of female subjects that capitalism had to destroy. The heretic, the healer, the disobedient wife, the woman who dared to live alone, the obeah woman who poisoned the master's food and inspired the slaves to revolt. So if you've read any of Terry Pratchett's witch books, this might be sounding a little bit familiar. This is definitely kind of how he depicts his female magic users. And I was thinking about this. I was kind of thinking about land enclosure and stuff when I was reading the Tiffany Aching books. But I was also thinking about kind of how magic use and magic users in the Pratchett universe were depicted. And I was reading this really great book by a guy called Geoffrey Burton Russell called Witchcraft in the Middle Ages that my brother bought me in some like secondhand bookshop in London, just going, oh, Dara kind of likes stuff about witches. And it turned out to be incredibly useful, unbelievably useful. So I'm not going to read this whole quotation because we are kind of running out of time. But essentially what he says is that when the witch hunts kind of started to happen, both in the Middle Ages and then kind of moving up into the Renaissance, what you get is a kind of a binding together of this idea of like high or kind of Kabbalistic magic that is generally conducted by male wizards. They tend to have books, they have diagrams, it's all very kind of academic and very thoughtful. And then you also have kind of what he calls low magic or maleficia, which is just like the small little things that people do on a day-to-day basis, like, you know, withering your neighbor's cow when you're annoyed with your neighbor or whatever, or, you know, poisoning their milk or something along those lines. And Geoffrey Burton Russell says that, linking to all the things that Silvia Federici was talking about, the witch trials kind of bind both of those together with this idea of the demonic pact of the magic user selling themselves to essentially the Christian Satan. And therefore, you know, what Russell is saying is that the vision of witchcraft that we have today, this idea of the evil witch who is entirely enthralled to the devil and who, you know, does all of these terrible things, but also uses spells, this is the creation of a particular time period. And it's also a very recent creation in lots of ways. So I was kind of thinking about that. I was thinking about the Tiffany Aching books, and I was trying to work out how stuff works, how magic works in the Pratchett universe. So I kind of started with my usual nice, tidy divisions, which do seem to kind of fit into Geoffrey Burton Russell's ideas of all of this. Generally, the wizards on the disc are entirely celibate, men, generally elderly men. They live and work in the Unseen University, which is it's very much an urban environment, but they are actually kind of cut off from the rest of the society that they're involved in. They might occasionally wander around Ankh-Morpork, but they're not really part of all of that. They do tend to have money. You don't tend to see a poor wizard very often, and they don't have an awful lot to do. I don't know when they ever teach. I don't think they know when they ever teach. They also have a lot of stuff. You have to have your pointy hat with wizard written on it, in spangles with 2 Zs, and you have to have books and all the rest of it. Witches live a very different life. They can marry if they want to, they just don't really tend to. They are very much involved in their communities. The magic that they do, if we can even call it magic, is part of the community. It's not kind of separated off by the walls of the Unseen University. They tend to be poor, and they have quite a complex relationship with objects, with the trappings of magic. And this was really kind of what I was thinking about when I was thinking about Tiffany Aching, that they seem to sort of eschew material objects, and yet at the same time, they need the hat, they need the boffo occasionally in order to be able to kind of set themselves up as actual witches. And I guess what really struck me was that for Tiffany, this relationship to things is really fraught. And as the books go on, it almost kind of becomes more fraught, I think, particularly in Wintersmith in lots of ways. And kind of what I started thinking was that in some ways you could kind of see the movement of the books as a movement of her working out her relationship to things. And I think that this really kind of comes to a head in I Shall Wear Midnight. And this is where all of those ideas around witches, not just as people who do folk magic, but as people who are involved in some sort of terrible diabolical thing, that really kind of comes to the fore in a way that it hasn't, I think, in some of the other Discworld books, because Tiffany ends up kind of coming up against the cunning man, who is the spirit of anti-witch feelings. And I think she explains this really well when she's shoved into prison. She's trying to explain to the poor sergeant, who really likes her, doesn't really want her to be in prison at all, but you know, that spirit of kind of intolerance and prejudice is loose on the chalk. And she says, okay, there's all this kind of stuff that I have to do. This notebook is full of things that I have to do because I'm the witch. And if I don't do them, who will? But she says, I can't help, because the wicked witch must be locked up in a case. Must be locked up in case she gets her hands on a loaded spinning wheel for a fairy story. The trouble is, she says, I think somebody might die. And if I let them die, then I'm a bad witch. The trouble is, I'm a bad witch anyway. I must be, because you've locked me up. So she's in this terrible bind. And I think, I don't know, I was very upset the first time that I was reading these. I was like, why is Tiffany being tortured? Why does it seem like every time she uses her magic, every time she gets a little bit ambitious, every time she tries to be a person, it's like the world kind of clamps back down on her and says, no, you're going to be punished when you do this. You're going to end up with like some awful enemy who you're going to have to fight, and no one is going to help. And she's working so hard. And I really felt very sorry for her. So I was trying to kind of push what I knew about the development of witchcraft together with what was going on in this book. And just very quickly, as I'm sure you know, so in We Free Men, she's the one who saves the Baron's son from the Queen of the Elves. Then in A Hat Full of Sky, she faces this kind of creature called the Hiver, who is literally called up because she is doing like non-witchy magic. She's doing things that are almost wizardly, almost that kind of doing stuff with spells, being a little bit arrogant, pushing above her station a little bit. And the Hiver kind of sees her and comes and attaches himself to her. And as a result, she ends up buying loads of stuff. Like this is kind of what happens. She becomes someone who wants things rather than someone who is selfless. And again, this was kind of hurting me a little bit. I was like, can poor Tiffany not be a little bit selfish just for a minute? Can she not buy the nice cloak? Why does that have to mean that something is terrible? But it gets worse, because then in Wintersmith, she kisses the spirit of winter, and then she ends up getting stalked by him. And the only way that she can really free herself is by throwing away the necklace. That's like something that she sees as kind of part of her identity. But I think that it's in I Shall Wear Midnight that things turn around a little bit. And I really kind of thought for a long while when I was reading it that this was going to kind of go down the same path. And even the first and second times that I read it, I was like, oh, poor Tiffany, she is getting blamed for doing too much magic, being too ambitious. And this has kind of called the cunning man into being. And now all witches are being punished for it. But essentially, kind of what happens by the end of I Shall Wear Midnight is that so Roland, who is now the Baron, who she saved from the fairies, gets infected by the kind of terrible thought process from the cunning man. And it isn't just that he locks Tiffany up, but he also wants to dig into the mound, the home of the Nac-Mac-Feegle, who are kind of Tiffany's friends and allies. And the language that the Nac-Mac-Feegle come out with is very much the language of enclosure. You know, they don't want nae laird, nae baron, all of that kind of thing. They don't want any more land clearances. They talk in that language of this is what is happening. And she manages to stop that from happening. This is the one thing that kind of, there is a turning point, I think, in this book. And then as a result, in The Shepherd's Crown, she kind of reconnects herself back to the land by, I think, forming an alliance with the Queen of the Elves, who before that has been her enemy. But now that the Queen of the Elves is getting usurped by someone who's even worse, things kind of get fixed. So I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but yeah, essentially, I was a little bit worried that there was a glass ceiling on the disc, that Tiffany was trying to not do witch magic, that she was trying to do wizard magic, and that she was therefore kind of blurring some kind of sacred boundary to a certain extent. But actually, what happens in I Shall Wear Midnight is that it turns out that she didn't call the cunning man. It's actually Roland's pretty fiancée, Letitia, who doesn't know that she's a witch. And once Tiffany and Letitia stop being jealous of each other and actually start kind of having a community of witches together, everything is kind of fine. Now, Tiffany does still have to face the cunning man all by herself, but she's able to leverage her relationship with Letitia to stop Roland from digging into the Feegle mound. And, you know, therefore, as a result, I think everything that happens in The Shepherd's Crown flows gently from there. So those are generally my thoughts. Thank you very much.